Clearly, since 9/11 and the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the question of the role of religious ideology in ethnic, civil, and regional conflicts around the globe has weighed heavily upon the public consciousness and the political debates of the new millennium. Long before that terrible September morning, Mark Juergensmeyer was hard on the trail of religiously inflected terrorism, rebellion, and politics. As early as 1993, his book, The New Cold War, Religious Nationalism Confronts the Secular State, examined the rising global tide of religious activism by combining the study of broad socio-political trends with extensive personal interviews of religious activists for the purpose of attaining a synoptic vantage point from which to understand what, for many Western observers, has been the utterly perplexing resurgence of political religion around the globe. And just 1 year before 9/11, Juergensmeyer published a book devoted to getting into the heads of religious extremists, Terror in the Mind of God, the global rise of religious violence. I dare say that we are fortunate to have with us tonight one of the world's leading experts on the often dark alliance between religion and violence. Mark Juergensmeyer holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York. He is director of the Orphelia Center for Global and International Studies, professor of sociology, and affiliate professor of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He has published more than 200 articles and 20 books, including most recently, Global Rebellion, Religious Challenges to the Secular State. He's editor of the Oxford Handbook of Global Religion and co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Global Studies. He is currently working on a book entitled God and War, based on his Stafford Little lectures delivered at Princeton University. Professor Juergensmeyer has held research fellowships from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the American Council of Learned Societies. He's the 2003 recipient of the prestigious Grawemeyer Award for contributions to the study of religion, and is the 2004 recipient of the Silver Award of the Queen Sofia Center for the Study of Violence in Spain. He's past president of the American Academy of Religion, and he chairs the Working Group on Religion and International Affairs for the National Social Science Research Council. I could continue with the list of honors and honorary degrees and so forth, but I think you want to hear from him, not me. Please join me in welcoming Mark Juergensmeyer.
Well, thank you, Brett, and thank you, Joan, for your help in the arrangement, and I want to thank also the Center for Ethics and Society at Stanford and the Department of Religious Studies for sponsoring me here today. It's a great pleasure to be at Stanford and see how beautifully the campus has developed. But I have to tell you, having taught at Berkeley for over half of my career, coming to Stanford is a little bit like going across the DMZ. You know it's there, but you don't quite know what to expect. And I'm always kind of pleasantly surprised to see that people actually, have running water and indoor plumbing and the internet and other forms of modern social amenities here at Stanford. I'm glad that you're really more like us than I had imagined. I've been working on the area of religion and violence, as Brett said, for some 25 years. It's been a consuming passion to try to get at the heart of what has become, for me, both an intellectual issue as someone who studied religion and politics all my life, an obvious problem in public affairs, but also in some ways a personal concern. The leading questions for me has been, why is it religious, this rise of religious politics? Why is it political? And why is it happening now? Now, I got interested in the topic because of the Sikhs. The Sikhs are a community of people in northern India and the Punjab region who are come out of the mix of Hindu with Islam, Bhakti tradition of medieval India. And they're lively, vibrant, exuberant people. I think they must have been Californians in their last life, and that's a compliment, in case you're wondering. So for me, it was a matter of puzzlement as well as a fascination to see this awful spiral of violence between the Sikh community, young Sikhs in the Indian state, led by this man, Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. And after a terrible confrontation with the Indian government in the mid-1980s, in which Indira Gandhi, under very bad advice, decided to invade the Golden Temple of the Sikhs in order to capture Bhindranwale, who was held up there for his headquarters. And in response, thousands of Sikhs were killed, and then later that year, Mrs. Gandhi herself was killed by her own bodyguards, who were Sikhs. I decided to go to the Punjab and try to find out why. Why is it religious? Why is it political? Why is it happening now? Now, Bhindranwale was dead, but I looked at his videotapes and audio tapes of his speeches. I talked with people who had sat at his feet. And what I expected to find is what we were told we're usually going to find in such cases. We're going to find a case of where religion is being used by wily politicians for political purposes. But that's not what I found. Bhindranwale, after all, was not a politician. He was a preacher. He was a kind of a country preacher who came from the rural areas of the Punjab, and he spoke with a rural accent in his Punjabi. And he would look out over the sea of young men, and it was invariably young men who had shaved their beards and who had clipped their hair. And you're not supposed to as a Sikh. You're supposed to let your hair grow long. And he'd say, "You've lost it. You've lost the tradition. You've chosen the easy path. Look at you. You're wearing your slick pants and your pointed shoes, and you're hankering after government positions and easy positions within the university. You don't realize there's a battle going on, a struggle, a fight between truth and evil and good and bad and religion and irreligion. You have to follow the path of the gurus and get right with the path of the gurus and make straight your life. You have to pick up the sword of faith and fight like soldiers." Now, what an extraordinary message. This was a message of faith, not of politics. And I had heard this message before. I didn't grow up a Sikh. I grew up as a pious Protestant in southern Illinois, in a very sleepy little kind of rural area. And I can tell you it gets very boring in southern Illinois in the summer until the revivals come to town. And then the tent comes up and the music comes out and the bands play and everybody gathers together. And suddenly it's hallelujah, save the Lord. And I remember one occasion there was a guy who dressed up in military camouflage, and like it was a soldier in a battle, and he was stood up in front of all of us and he growled and he said, "You Christians call yourself Christians, but you're not really Christians because you've chosen the easy path. You don't realize there's a battle going on. A war between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion. And it's all around you right now. And all you have to do is to take up the sword of the Lord right now and come down the sawdust path of forgiveness and praise to the Lord, hallelujah, and be saved." Well, who wouldn't respond to that call? I myself was saved on a couple occasions because when you live a kind of messy, ordinary, boring life, and after all, who of us doesn't, in our basis, who of us doesn't want to be called to something higher, something more important, something that gets at the realities of the world beyond all the mundane, tedious aspects of daily life? And to be called into that great battle is, after all, to be called into something real, a struggle for the most important things of life. Now, for most of us, of course, that's a kind of metaphor. We don't really expect to go out and kill somebody. We think that this battle is the battle of the soul. It's going on within. We think that ordinarily Christianity thinks of the internal battle just that way. And it usually does. But not always. There are, after all, Christians who see this battle, this eternal struggle, and they see it being played out on a political template, and they see it being played out in the real world, and they think that they can take up real weapons. They can take up real arms, and whether they're followers of the Aryan nation or whether there's Timothy McVeigh, who created in the attack on the Oklahoma City Federal Building the largest act of terrorism on American soil before 9/11, and it was a Christian act of terrorism. If you read Timothy McVeigh's favorite book, The Turner Diaries, it's a battle about war. It's a story about war. It's a novel about great confrontation, a struggle. And it's a call to arms, and he was hoping that if people saw this attack on the Oklahoma City Federal Building, they would realize there was a war going on. There was something more important, that clarion call had come for them to take arms and to try to break through this grip of secularism, which he saw in control of American civilization, and to change it. That's what Anders Breivik thought he was doing in Oslo just last year. He thought that by attacking the office buildings downtown in Oslo, by attacking members of a youth camp of the Liberal Party, he would get at the multiculturalism that was keeping these forces of change that he thought was dramatically changing Northern Europe, just like the siege of the gates of Vienna centuries before, to keep the Muslims from taking over their society. That's what he thought was happening. He was a Christian who thought that he was in a real battle, a real war. And yet every religious tradition has these images, these extraordinary images of cosmic war. Now this picture is from Hinduism. You're saying, oh, Hinduism, that's a very nice religion. They believe in nonviolence, don't they? Yes. But the major epics of Hinduism, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are all about war. And this particular scene is the Mahabharata, where two sets of cousins, the Kauravas and Pandavas, are battling with each other. In this case, one of the princes is about to go into battle, and he wonders out loud. He says to himself, why the devil am I doing this? I'm either going to be killed or I'm going to get killed. Either way, it's bad business. Says this out loud, and as luck would have it, the chariot driver just happens to be Lord Krishna. So Lord Krishna says, you wonder why you have to do these things? I'll tell you why you have to do these things. And so Lord Krishna, the auspicious one, goes on to do this song of the auspicious one, which is what the words Bhagavad Gita means, with this story, which is at the heart of Hinduism, and the Bhagavad Gita today is regarded as the central tract within the Hindu tradition. But it's about war. It's about struggle. And why you have to struggle, because all life is struggle. You can't avoid it. Mohandas Gandhi, in reading this tract, discovered in it a kind of way of looking at conflict in general, that all life is conflict. And he read this Bhagavad Gita message as saying you have to learn how to fight ethically, morally, because you can't escape fighting. So there's no point in waiting to get moral after the fight. You have to fight in a way that's pure. But the point is that image of struggle is central to the Hindu tradition, as it is to Christianity, as it is to Islam, as it is to Judaism. There are strains of battle in Buddhism. Every tradition has these extraordinary images. When I began to try to probe the background of modern contemporary actors of religious violence, I interviewed some of the people involved in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. And Mahmoud Abulima, who is Time magazine put on its cover as being an essential conspirator, agreed to have an interview with me. I was the only scholar or journalist to have ever interviewed Abulima. He was convicted and being held in prison at the Lompoc Federal Penitentiary. And when I talked with Abulima about his kind of the way he saw the world, he was a very affable, pleasant guy. And yet, when the topic began to turn to religion and politics, his eyes would narrow, and he would look at me, and he'd grip my arm, and the guards would suddenly rush around because they were afraid that he was going to take me captive. He would brush him off and say, no. I want to make the point. He said, Mr. Mark, you people are like sheep. You just don't know what's going on. Your government won't let you know. And the newspapers, the media have all bought in this image that everything's calm and easy and everything's pleasant. That's not the way it is, Mr. Mark. That's not what's happening. I said, well, what's happening? He said, there's a war going on, Mr. Mark. There's a battle between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion, and your government is the enemy. It won't let you see it. And I said, well, is that why people bomb buildings in order to tell us there's a war going on? He just sat back and he smiled and he said, well, now you know. And of course, after 2001, we all knew that this image of cosmic war, this great struggle, this battle, is behind the thinking of so many of the activists in contemporary actions of violence related to religion. So, in answer to my own question, what religion has to do with it, you can say, in a sense, nothing, because many of these situations are issues of political contest over property, over territory. Palestinians or Israelis control Jerusalem. What is the future of the Middle East? The whole issue of colonialism and dominance. Yes, these are all part of the background, and yet these pervading images of cosmic war. Religion itself may not be a problem, and you can argue that religions ordinarily have to do with peace, and that's absolutely true. And yet they also have these images, these extraordinary images. And it's not just, of course, the images, but also the ethical justification for violence. Religion is the only entity besides the state that can give moral sanction for violence, and therefore is always potentially revolutionary. It always is a basis of power because it is a basis for the legitimization of violence. It's no surprise that somebody might seek access to it wanting to be in a revolutionary frame, but it's also a form of mobilization. It has all of those characteristics. But behind this is the abiding image of cosmic war. Well, that explains the religious part. Why are they political? Let me go back to my case about the Sikhs. Remember, I said that I expected Bhindranwale to be somebody who used religion for political purposes. And what I found instead, that in a sense he was using politics for religious purposes. He was lifting a political struggle into the grand proscenium of cosmic war, of kind of religionizing a conflict, and in doing so, putting it into that absolutistic moral frame of reference, which is quite true. But and yet, what was striking about this case, and as I went to not only the Sikh case but around the world, so frequently found that these were not conflicts over religion in any kind of narrow sense. After all, Bhindranwale was not embroiled in a hatred against Hindus as such, or Muslims, but it was the secular state. Bhindranwale's concern was not so much other religionists or other people who differed from him in belief, but rather that woman, he couldn't even say her name. He would stutter when he spoke about Indira Gandhi. He would say, that woman born in a house of Brahmins, she's the one who's caused all these problems. And imagine, of course, her to be not a spokesperson for, in any narrow sense, Hinduism, but of a kind of template of social order and of construct of moral life for which religion had very little place. Now, we understand that to be normal. That's what the secular world is supposed to be about ever since the Enlightenment. And yet, for Bhindranwale, he saw it as something that was not just amoral or a-religious, but anti-religious. In fact, there's no easy word in any Indian language for a-religious in the sense of secular. It always translates into anti-religion, which is also true in Arabic, interestingly. So the whole concept of the secular world, which we take to be normal, was taken to be something was antithetical to the idea of a religious community, the role of religion in public life, which in his mind was the only proper way in which one could fulfill one's religious obligations. So poor Mrs. Gandhi, as she puzzled on this cover of India Today, weeks before the invasion of the Golden Temple, about what to do, trying to think of there's some way out, said she'd given them everything they wanted Why are these Sikhs still unhappy? Of course, what she didn't know was that she was really moving into a whole scenario of cosmic war, a kind of situation in which she was the embodiment of all that was evil. It was not anything she could do. It's what she was. What she symbolizes was the problem. So there's nothing that she could easily do to demonize herself other than trying not to act like the demon that they said she was, and yet she did exactly that. She took the bad advice of her generals, and they said, oh, the only way you can fight these people, it's the only thing they realize, these terrorists, is violence. You've got to fight fire with fire. You've got to go in with the army. You've got to go in with the military and root them out and get rid of this guy, chop off the head of the dragon. You kill the whole dragon. That's what they tell us. That's what these advisors tell them. And sure enough, that's what Mrs. Gandhi did. They brought in the army, they brought in the tanks, and they were supposed to be in and out one night, but it didn't quite work that way, for one thing. They had trouble getting the tanks in the front door, and they had to go out and get bulldozers, and they had to bulldoze down the steps of the Golden Temple, and by that time it was into the next day and then into the day after. In the meantime, there were more supplies coming in to back up Bhinderwali, and there were about 1,000 people trapped in between the two forces, and most of them were killed in the ensuing battle. Finally, they did get Bhinderwali, but the whole of the Sikh community around the world was incensed. It was as if there was a group of Catholic extremists holed up in the Vatican, and the Italian government decided just to destroy the Vatican to get rid of them. Well, that would not go over very big in the Catholic world, and this didn't go over very big in the Sikh community as well. So later that year, as Mrs. Gandhi walked through the garden of her estate to her office, her own bodyguards turned on her and riddled her full of bullets. They were Sikhs, and she had trusted them, not knowing that they were incensed by what they thought was a violation of sacred space by the secular authority. So this interesting notion of rise of religious politics in an era of secularism is a motif that stands behind so many other instances of struggle. I went south of India to Sri Lanka, for example, where there was and still is a great deal of tension between the Tamil community in the north and the Sinhalese in the south. And to my surprise, the Buddhist monks in the south, and you'd think Buddhism, if you're looking for a religion of peace, Buddhism, there you've got it, right? Well, about a month ago in Colombo, there was a peace rally in Colombo, and they were Muslims and Christians and Buddhists all rallying together, and they came around a corner, and out came these guys, Buddhist monks with clubs in their hands, and they started beating on the peace marchers, and it said, if you want peace, go up to Jaffna, go up to northern Sri Lanka, go away, because there will never be peace in Sri Lanka until Sri Lanka is a Sinhalese Buddhist state. So in their mind, this accommodation to the Hindus of the north, this secular notion of multiculturalism was something that they thought was threatening to the very idea of a Buddhist community in Sri Lanka. Their real concern was with the secular state. Much as the same is true in Iran. It's not terribly violent, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978, the first of the great movements of religious politics in the contemporary period, kind of the grandfather of movements all over the world. But the Ayatollah Khomeini had in mind not just the excesses of power of the Shah, but also the way in which the Shah was trying to modernize, or secularize, trying to bring Iran into the modern world. And what the Ayatollah saw was not modernization, he saw as de-Islamicization. And for him, they coined a whole new term, West toxification, to be inebriated with things Western. And this was the challenge. The real enemy, the real confrontation was not just with the Shah, but was a whole way of thinking, a whole kind of secular lifestyle that had been brought with the Shah from the West to Iran. And Iran needed to recover its sense of identity, its character, its Islamic roots. It's interesting how much this is a part of so many struggles. In the 1980s, in Afghanistan, the previous Afghan war was with the Soviet Union, which was seen as an intrusive foreign power attempting to create a different kind of culture and a different kind of society, a secular socialist one in Afghanistan. And the Mujahideen rebelled. At that time, of course, we were still in the Cold War. And at that time, the Soviet Union were those godless commies that we were opposed to. So there's this extraordinary footage of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Jimmy Carter's chief international policy advisor, standing on a tank in Afghanistan, pleading to the Mujahideen, fight on for Allah. Now, can you imagine Hillary Clinton, standing on a tank in Kabul, or Condoleezza Rice, fight on. No, I don't think so, because now, of course, the godless commies are a thing of the past, and in a sense, radical Islam is the new communism. It's the new perceived global threat. And so now we have become the new Soviet Union. We have become the new foreign presence. The United States has become the secular enemy. In the eyes of the Afghanis, the Taliban is simply a replacement for the Mujahideen and trying to cleanse Afghanistan of what it perceives as to be foreign intruders, not just foreigners, but foreign intruders bringing an alien ideology of the secular state. In many ways, this is a part of the politics not just of Afghanistan, but of other parts of South Asia and the Middle East. Pakistan is not, by itself, a terribly religious society. I mean, in the last elections, only 7% of the votes went to Islamist parties. And yet, the presence of the American military, the drone attacks, and the increasing strength of the Pakistani Taliban, a group that didn't exist before 2001, and it was created largely because of Pashtuns coming over from Afghanistan, joining their Pashtun brothers in Waziristan and Baluchistan and in the western mountain areas of Pakistan, and fighting and organizing and mobilizing with increasing support of the Pakistani population what is perceived to be an alien external threat. Us, the United States. The Pew Foundation did a recent survey in Pakistan and found that only 7% of the Pakistanis identify the Taliban as a major political threat. 15% identified India as their old enemies. And 49%, almost half, identified the United States as the major threat. So increasingly we're there, our very presence is perceived as the threat more than the people that we're trying to remove the threat from, that is the Taliban, from the Pakistanis. We've gotten ourselves into an awful cycle in which the perception has been that we're trying to recreate Pakistan and Afghan society in a way that's not true to their own traditional roots. Now, there's no question that President Obama would like desperately to get out of that situation. Most Americans increasingly feel that that's a venture that we cannot be infinitely sustained. But to do that, of course, means working out some sort of agreement with those elements of the Taliban that we can negotiate with in order to provide them with the sense that there is a network of domestic support. There is a domestic coalition, political coalition that can endure after the Americans are gone and without Pakistan simply absorbing Afghanistan as it tried to do previously. It's a delicate moment. I think it is possible for this transition to take place. But in this background is this continuing theme of religious politics versus the secular state. In Egypt, this was very clearly a part of the ideological framework of Sayyid Qutb and the first founders of Hassan al-Banna, the first founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, the idea that there is an intrusion of Western politics that's trying to, ideological intrusion, trying to frame the very concept of the nation state and of multicultural politics is trying to reframe the Middle East into Western eyes. And that, of course, has fueled movements for political activism and power throughout Egypt. There's not just one kind of Muslim brotherhood, of course. It's much more complicated than that. But its origins are in this sense, that there is a limited possibility in the ability of secular ideology to provide a moral framework for a social community. And particularly in times of frustration, this is an extraordinarily appealing image. Right across the border from Egypt and Palestine in the 1990s, this idea, the idea that is framed by the Muslim Brotherhood and is supported by the ideology of Sayyid Qutb, that there is a moral basis for political order, became the instrument of a new movement of Palestinian nationalism, one based on religion. Now you're saying, well, of course, because we all know that, in the Middle East, the Jews and the Muslims have been fighting each other for centuries. It's simply, no, they haven't. They really haven't. The religionization of the conflict has been a very recent thing, only in the last 20 years or so. I mean, before that time, the Palestinian Liberation Movement was primarily a secular movement. Yasser Arafat was very much of a secular person. He was Muslim, of course. He was married to a Christian, a Palestinian Christian, but a Christian. It was a movement for which religion was not very important. In fact, they didn't even trust the mullahs. They didn't have any place within the activism of the movement. It was only during the first Intifada and the frustration that nothing was happening in terms of Palestinian nationalism that a new movement was born. And it was a movement, I happened to be there in the early 1990s, one of the few people to be able to interview Sheikh Yassin. And Sheikh Yassin is the leader of the movement and the kind of founding central figure, told me that Palestine would never be truly free until it was an Islamic state, until it was a Muslim vision of Palestine. Now the curious thing was, I had been in Israel for some time before I visited Sheikh Yassin, and I had just talked with a Jewish activist who is speaking in terms of a religious vision of Israel. This guy, Meir Kahane. And Meir Kahane told me almost the same thing. He said that Israel would not be Israel until it's biblical Israel. Because he had a vision of an Israel which was not just a secular state, which was, of course, the way Israel was created. Israel was not created to be a religious state. I mean, the first flag of Israel had 7 stars in it, and the 7 stars would be for the 7 hours of a working class day. I mean, they were a socialist. Their idea was to create a good, for Jews, of course, but a good socialist society for working people, the kibbutz, all that kind of energy into a whole new kind of social experiment. The religionization of Israel came really after the 1967 war, with the idea of the expansion of Israel into the West Bank and the vision of some messianic Zionists that they were in not just a secular political experiment. There's this daunting, extraordinary idea that they were perilously close to the recreation of biblical Israel, the recreation of the temple on Temple Mount and the Davidic kingship. And all that was about to happen. They were just seized with this extraordinary image. Now, this was a new thing within Israel. This is not an old idea within the modern state of Israel. This was something that boiled up in the 1970s and 1980s at precisely the time that the Palestinian Muslims were creating their own ideas of a kind of an apocalyptic moment when Palestine would be truly Islam. The 2 different strands of religious politics curiously developing kind of in response to one another and with images that make it extremely difficult for secular politicians to negotiate issues of land when you have people arguing out of religious visions of religious states. The religionization of politics can be a very difficult thing with which to deal. And then there are these guys. where did they come from? They really are quite striking. The idea of a transnational, not just religious nationalism, not just a religious politics that's related to a nation state, but a transnational image of a global war, a global confrontation. I mean, these guys really are a part of the religious radicals of the 21st century because they think in global terms. They think in an imagined global conflict between two great forces of globalization, one led by the West, by America, and another a kind of inchoate Islamic version of globalization. Traditional religious politicians don't understand it. When I went back to Gaza after 2001, people in Hamas would come up to me and say, this Osama bin Laden, what's his deal? What's he after all? You know, he has no government, he has no plan, he has no army, he has no state. What is it that he wants? Well, all I could tell him was, well, he's involved in cosmic war. And they said, bosh. You know? That makes no sense. It made no sense to them. They were fighting for something real. They were part of a struggle that had a real state, a real people, a real community, a real government. But these guys, they only had this image of a global conflict, this small band of people with this extraordinary image and the enormous power of terrorism. And when they displayed it, particularly in 2001, for the world to see, this was a captivating moment for the world. It was a scenario which I describe as performance violence in my books, an attempt to try to create an image of warfare. As Abulima was describing, the guy who was earlier trying to bring down the World Trade Center. He wanted to create an image of war so compelling that you couldn't go away from the view of that without realizing that there was a war going on. And it's true, you can't look at that scene. You can't have experienced it as we all did during 2001 without thinking there's something going on. There's an image of war in somebody's minds that would do something this awful, this terrible. There was no need for any explanation, any kind of disclaimer, or a little message to crawl across the television screen saying this act of terrorism has been brought to you by such and such for such and such reason. You didn't need to know that. All you needed to see was this. And you saw cosmic war, extraordinary battle. When I asked Abulima about such images, with regard to his own attempts at bringing down the World Trade Center, it was clear that it was meant for the Muslim world. It was meant to kind of, as Timothy McVeigh meant in attacking the Oklahoma City Federal Building, it was meant to wake us up, to get us involved in the war. And this was meant not just for CNN, but for Al Jazeera. You know, it was for television throughout the Muslim world to get people to rise up to battle against the evil and to realize that the battle had come and the time had come. The Muslim world is much too smart for that. There was very little. In fact, there was a conspiracy theory throughout much of the Muslim world that it couldn't possibly be Muslims who would do such a thing. It's a horrible act. It was probably the CIA. Or maybe Jews. Maybe it was the Mossad, the Israeli secret police. But why couldn't have been Muslims? They didn't bite the bait. But somebody else did. The day of September 11th, these were the headlines. I went back and looked at all of the headlines of the newspapers on September 11th, and they were like this. They were terrible act of terrorism, USH attack. The word war did not appear until September 12th. Then suddenly, the newspapers said they're acts of war, in quotation marks. Quotation marks, I wonder who said that. Any idea?
Our government.
Yes, unfortunately, the president decided to proclaim to the world that these were not just acts of terror, these were acts of war. And so this whole image of the war on terror, and you can imagine how I felt about it. I was watching all of this thinking, oh my God, they're using Osama bin Laden's language. They're buying into his worldview. They're like, what's going on here? This is a guy who you should find this guy, bring him to justice. He's got a bratty little terrorist band up in the hills in Afghanistan, But why validate him by suddenly using his language to talk about a war on terror? So for 8 years, our foreign policy was dominated by an image of the war on terror. That term that makes absolutely no sense, of course, because terror is a method. It's not a person or a position. But it was imagined that there was a cosmic war, a great battle between truth and evil, of good and bad, and right and wrong. It was that old kind of Manichaean vision that had mobilized the terrorists who did this act in the first place. And we were kind of, in mere terms, responding back in ways using the kind of force that absolutely delighted most of the Al-Qaeda operatives, because now the war was actually happening. It wasn't just an imagined war anymore. It was a real war. You could look out over Afghanistan, and you could see the bombs come down. You could look out over Iran, and you could Iraq, and you could see the bombs come down. The war had come into existence. And as a result, of course, the anti-Americanism around the world of people who didn't want to be dumped into the category of potential terrorists or sympathizers with terrorists, of course, the very anger of being marginalized in that way, in fact, made them potential terrorists. And the acts of terrorism, in fact, increased related to Al-Qaeda ideology. I had calculated about once a year before 2001. After 2001, it was several times a year, and fairly dramatic instances at that. We're talking about the Spain and Madrid attacks, the London attacks, the Bali attacks. The attacks proliferated in part energized by now the internet and coded websites and the transmission of videos, kind of recruiting videos on the website. So this fantastic war, this imagined war, was spirited and propelled in part because we were playing the role, because the United States became, especially after the invasion of Iraq, became that evil enemy that they had said existed all along. Finally, the U.S. had come out of the closet, and it was acting like the evil enemy that they said it was. That was a remarkable thing. I went to Baghdad right after the U.S. invasion in 2004 to try to understand the Islamicization of the insurgency, and talked with this fellow in the center, who is the head of the Association of Muslim Clerics from the Al-Anbar province, which is the Sunni area. And at that time, they were the leaders of the insurgency against the United States. This picture, you'll see my colleague Mary Calder from the London School of Economics on the left. The two of us came on a project with Baghdad University on religion and politics, and our translators on the right. And at one point, this guy told me, Mr. Mark, he said, you want to know why the U.S. invaded Iraq? We finally figured it out. I said, well, please, a lot of Americans are asking the same question. Tell me. And he said, he says, it has nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction or oil or any of those things. He said, Saddam Hussein was a CIA puppet. I said, no, I didn't know that. He said, oh, yes, he's a CIA puppet. He was the last war with Iran. Your leaders were over here. And I said, oh, that's right. I remember Rumsfeld was over at the time. Yes, that's right. Saddam Hussein was a CIA puppet, and he was weak. And we all knew that he was putting up this weapons of mass destruction thing as a kind of show of power, because he didn't have any power. And his government was about to fall to the Islamic Revolution. And that's why the Americans had to come in. They had to come in and get rid of him and rule directly, because they didn't want the Islamic Revolution to happen. And I remember at the time thinking, this is crazy. Oh, and then he said, oh, Mr. Mark, he said, and by the way, he said, you Americans will not succeed, because Islam will prevail. Now, what an amazing thing to think that we were there to fight against Islam. And I went away thinking, I've never heard, this is a crazy conspiracy theory. And I started asking people, other parts of Baghdad, including sectarists, journalists, political leaders, they said, yeah, we agree with that. Yeah, we think there's something to that. Your country has this phobia about Islamic politics, and I think that's probably true. We don't think they was about to fall to the Islamic Revolution, but yeah, we think that's probably one of the main motivations. Maybe they're right. But the perception is that they needed to be violent. They needed to be strong. They needed to stand up against the forces of the secular West because they needed to have their own domestic revolution. Well, there has become in recent months a new revolution in the Middle East. But it's one that's not necessarily violent. This is a traffic circle in Cairo. It's an ordinary traffic circle. It's a major location in the city. It's called Tahrir Square. And a little over a year ago, it began to look like this. As increasingly the place got populated with more and more and more demonstrators, hundreds of thousands, who then wouldn't leave. As the government tried to disrupt them, Mubarak sent in his horses and his camels and his goons. They wouldn't leave. And this phenomenon, now known as kind of the Tahrir Square phenomenon, was not propelled by violence or by insurrection or by secret cadres, but by cell phone and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube images. It was a modern revolution conveyed through modern technology. And the result, of course, was the change of Mubarak. This is me, not there a year ago, but just a couple months ago on Tahrir Square for a continuing protest, in this case against the military government, the feeling that the military government had hijacked the revolution and keeping it from happening. But the remarkable thing, it seems to me, is that this is, in some ways, also a religious revolution. I mean, maybe not all of the activists in Tahrir Square, the young people, appear to be all that religiously motivated, and yet the imams were very much involved. The local mosque right next to Tahrir Square was a center of activism. It was a meeting place. It was an impromptu hospital. The imams it was after the prayers on Friday would be the moments of protest, and often stimulated by the imams. But it was not the strident jihadi message of Islam. In fact, there would be placards showing Christian symbols and Muslim symbols showing that the Coptic Christians and the Muslims could work together. There was an interesting and dramatic moment during the protest when the Mubarak's goons were trying to trample over the Muslim protesters as they prayed, because they were praying in the prayers at the time of the protest. And Christians ringed around to allow them to pray, to protect them. And then on Sunday, when the Christians prayed, the Muslims gathered around the Coptic Christians so that they could pray. So they had this remarkable symbol of both a religious spirit to the protest, but also a religious unity in the protest, that at least for the moment gave an image of a different kind of religious society in Egypt. Will that continue? Hard to say. I mean, since then, you can ask yourself, who have been the winners and the losers of Arab Spring? I mean, certainly among the losers have been the violent jihadi terrorists. I mean, not only is bin Laden dead, but in some ways the movement, and not just because of the Navy SEALs that came into Abbottabad and killed bin Laden, but by Arab Spring that really shifted the moral weight, the fulcrum, from a violent jihadi message to one of democratic and popularist protest. And so the image of bin Laden is not the brave warrior, but it's like this sad old revolutionary looking at pictures of himself on television, endless reruns of his glory days, that kind of endures. So it may be that violent jihad has been killed by Arab Spring. What about us? What about the United States? Are we winners or losers? When I was in Cairo a couple months ago, some of the guys said, "Hey, you're not Egyptian." I said, "Oh, well, okay, I'm not." They said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "California," quickly, hoping they wouldn't know it was in the United States.
And they said, oh, you're an American. And so one of the guys says, oh, we like Americans. We love Obama. And I said, oh. And the other guy says, no, we don't like Obama. I don't like Obama. And the other guy says, why not? He says, Obama came to Cairo and he gave a great speech. And the other guy said, yeah, but what has he done since then? I said, you're sounding like an American. I said, but the jury is still out on whether America, on one hand, we were the people who propped up Mubarak all those years. On the other hand, this kind of voice of support for democracy and democratic protest has been heard by at least some. And then certainly the winners of the military government. Like Pakistan, there is this kind of backbone of a military government, a civil order that continues regardless of the civilian governments, which may come and go. And the current attempt at elections are very much under the hands of the military government, guided by them. There's certainly talk when I was there about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and whether the military government was behind them. In the latest protests, the military government have accused, the Muslim Brotherhood has accused the military government of abandoning their support. But on the other hand, the military government has removed from competition some of the Salafis, the most extreme Islamic activists. See, there are several different kinds of religious politics in Egypt. First of all, there's several different Muslim brotherhoods, not just one, and different elements between the youth and the older entrenched guard, those who are more moderate, those who are more strident. Then there's the Salafis, the real fundamentalists, the real extremists supported from Saudi Arabia with a lot of Saudi money behind them. They came out of nowhere to get 20% of the votes in the election. God knows who these people are. And then there's the imams, the official clergy. And when I talked with the Grand Mufti of Egypt, he kind of was a pox on all of their houses. He had the feeling that these movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, is a lay movement. It's not a clerical movement. It doesn't come out of the official clergy. It's a lay movement that threatens, in some ways, the clerical establishment. And the Salafis just scare the hell out of him. So they are trying to position themselves in a way, in a post-Mubarak era, to be another kind of voice for reason and order and a moral clarity to give an Islamic presence within Egyptian society. But they're clear that Egypt, one thing is true, that Egypt's not a secular society. That whatever else it is, in this moment of extraordinary transformation, societies need the kind of grounding, the kind of moral fabric that religion brings to public life. And that brings me to my last point, why this is happening now in an era of globalization. Because it seems to me it's true that in an era where we all experience in some way the loss of personal and spiritual identity in a globalized world, we're threatened in three very basic ways. The forces of globalization challenge our sense of identity. Who are we in an era where everyone can live everywhere and everyone can be everywhere? Who are we as a people, as a community? It challenges our sense of accountability, that is, who's in charge? If the nation state no longer provides the sole parameters of law and order in public life, then who is really running things in the larger transnational sphere? And how can we be safe in such a location where there isn't this kind of boundaries and controls in public life on a global level? And religion responds to all three of these things: identity, accountability, and security. This whole basis of who you are, who's in charge, what's a real authority, how can you feel secure. So it's no surprise at this particular moment of global transformation that religion would return to public life with a vengeance to try to reassert itself, to try to claim a space for a different kind of moral order, but also with a moral critique. I thank you very much for your patience. I'm willing to respond to questions. You've been a very good audience.